Okay, we are officially starting our algebra journey now. And we're going to start by looking at variables and expressions and talking about what those are. So in order to do that, we have to have a shared common language that we use, and that's going to be, the vocabulary centered around just basic algebra. So let's look at some things and let's talk about what they're called, and so that we have an understanding on that. So this first thing I have written up here, right, this 2x plus 4. Okay, this whole thing, all right, is called an expression. All right, now there's two big terms you're going to hear a lot. You're going to hear expressions, and you're also going to hear about something called an equations. Now, the way you can tell an expression apart from an equation is an equation sign will always have an equation will always have an equal sign in it. Okay, that's why it's called an equation. It's got that equa, that equal in it. An expression is never necessarily equal to something. An expression is something that you would simplify, and that's the most you can do with it, whereas an equation is something that you solve. All right, so with expressions we simplify, right? We make them as simple as possible. With equations we solve them, and we solve them for a variable. So with expressions, you're not ever solving for a variable. You might simplify for something, but you won't ever solve for a variable. All right, so within the expression, there's some other really important terms we got to talk about. So the first thing we got to talk about is an expression is made up of things that are called terms. All right, so that's 4 is a term, 2x is a term, and then it will also have, the connectors, as I like to call them, and these are called operations. All right, and you have your 4 main operations, right? You've got, plus, minus, my brain's dying, multiplication, and division, right? So those are the 4 main ops that we deal with. And then also we'll talk later about like parentheses and exponents and all that. But the 4 main operations are those. And so let's break down this a little bit. So if we have a term that looks like this, right, that looks like 8x, pretty much 8x is made up of made up of 2 main pieces. So this part right here is called a coefficient. Now the Greek and Latin root word co means together, right? So it works together with it. So the 8 is together with the x, and the coefficient, and it basically explains how many of the x's we have. So we've got x is a variable, right? That's the other big term we got to talk about. X is my variable, and a variable is an unknown quantity. We don't know what it stands for, and the whole purpose of algebra is taking unknowns and then setting them up and manipulating things and doing things so that we can figure out what they are or get a range of what they might be. So the coefficient basically says if you have something written as 8x, that is the same thing as saying, well, it's 8 times x. All right, it could also be written like this, like 8x. Okay, so they all mean the same thing. You're generally speaking going to see it written this way the most because it's efficient and looks good. Now the other term I want to talk about, all right, is let's take a look at this guy right up here. Okay, he's considered a term, right? But he has his own name too. And whenever you see a number by itself, it's called a constant. All right, a constant is always a number that stands alone, a number by itself. So we've got, coefficients, variables, operators, and operations. We've got constants, we've got terms, we've got expressions, we've got simplifying, got a whole bunch of things going on here, right? But all really important stuff, and we have to make sure we we know what it means. The book also talks about like factors and powers and all that, and we'll talk more about powers and exponents and all that when we actually deal with exponents. A factor is just basically anything that multiplies by another thing. So you could say that 8 and x are factors of each other, right? So pretty much, though, that covers most of it. So let's talk about this really quick. Let's talk about exponents. All right, so we've got x to the third. What this means, all right, if you don't remember, this means this is repeated multiplication. That means it's a shorthand way of saying I'm going to multiply x by itself 3 times. And when you have a term like this, it's made up of, it's got parts that have names to it too. All right, so this part right here, the x, is called the base. All right, and then this other part here, there's 3. I like the orange, but you can't see it very well. The 3 is called the exponent. And one way we can, and we say this a number of different ways. You could say x to the third power is one way of saying it. You could say x cubed, because if you think of a cube, you're taking the same thing and multiplying it by itself 3 times because it's volume, right? You could say x raised to the power of 3. All right, so, and then variants on that. So that's kind of how that works and what that looks like. And then this last thing down here, I just want to show you, you know, pretty much, let's just break this down real quick. So if you have 4mn squared, that's like a shorthand way of saying, well, I have 4 and I'm multiplying it by m, and I'm also multiplying it by n, and I'm multiplying it by another n. I'm adding that to 2, which is being multiplied by n, and then we're adding that to 8. Right? And so each of these is still obviously its own term, right? That's a term, this is a term, and this is a term. And you see how, even though these are operators, the operators kind of belong to the term that they're just to the left to, because they tell you whether they're positive or negative, usually. So 4mn squared, so this is basically kind of like shorthand way of writing this. And but know that it is a product, all right? So whenever you have, you know, letters that are smushed together right next to each other, or numbers as well, that's a product. That's a multiplication thing. So this is actually saying 4 times, you know, m times n squared would be one way we could write that out. Or we could say the product of 4 comma m comma and n squared, right? So you could, there's a number of different ways you can say it, but just want to have some common language we're using, so in the next lesson you know what I mean when I'm saying, oh, variable or different things like that. So let's move on to that now.